me resume recording? Yes, here we go. Okay, admit all. Hello, everybody. Welcome to the webinar. We're just going to give all of the waiting room people just a second to log in. All righty, here we are. Well, welcome everybody. My name is Nadina Khala, and I'm so glad to have you all with us today. We have a very special program lined up for you. We are presenting a webinar from use case to business case, lessons from TreeTracker. And before we kick off, could I just quick note, just anyone that currently does not have their microphone muted to please do so. That just helps with any background noise. Great to see so many of you with your video on. That's definitely what we like to see. So for those of you that aren't shy, feel free to join us video wise. Great. So as I said, welcome to our webinar. We named it From Use Case to Business Case, Lessons from TreeTracker. This is going to be an interactive webinar with none other than Dirk van Riel. He is the founder and CEO of TreeTracker. And Dirk brings a very interesting perspective, not only to this webinar, but also to his company, which, as he will explain in much more detail, works on the automatic detection and identification and tracking of trees. And Dirk comes at this from an interesting angle because not only did he start his career in GIS consultancy, but he himself was actually a tree inspector for many, many years. And one of my favorite quotes from Dirk is that humans were not made to put points on a map. And I think that is especially critical to what we're going to be discussing today and how some of these new emerging technologies can actually help us move forward within the area of urban ecosystem management. I am going to be giving Dirk the floor in just a minute, but before I do so, I just wanted to let you all know that Dirk and I, well, Dirk is a very special guest because he was actually the very first guest on my podcast, the Internet of Nature podcast. And although Dirk is going to go into much detail in terms of what TreeTracker is all about, if you are at all interested in diving deep, the very first episode of Internet of Nature podcast covers Dirk's story and TreeTracker as well. So I encourage you to check that out on all of your favorite podcast apps. And just briefly to introduce myself, I'm Nadina Khala, as I mentioned, and I wear many different hats. I'm an ecological engineer, a podcast host, as you just heard, a speaker, and here today I'm sitting with my hat on as the community ambassador for the Smart Tech for Nature-Based Solutions community on the Connecting Nature Enterprise platform. And just briefly, what is the Connecting Nature Enterprise platform? Well, it is a global marketplace for nature-based solutions featuring the best-in-class nature-based enterprises. Now, that word might be new to some of you. Some of you may be new to the term nature-based solutions. Nature-based enterprises might be even newer. And essentially what nature-based enterprise platform does is it provides, the platform really provides a marketplace for buyers and suppliers of nature-based solutions. And within that, we have 10 different communities of practice, of which I am the ambassador of one of them called Smart Tech for Nature-Based Solutions. And essentially what we hope to do is we really want to provide this database of all of these different companies that at their very core are using nature-based solutions in some way. There are some 330 nature-based enterprises already on the platform, and we've got some 1,800 users, and they are really across these 10 different sectors. And the idea really here is to mix and match and hopefully match make a lot of these different communities with each other and these enterprises with each other to really offer this cross-pollination, which we need to kind of further this sector of nature-based solutions. Now, as I mentioned, we have these 10 different communities of practice. And the one that this webinar falls under is the one that you see here on the right, Smart Tech for Nature-Based Solutions. We have a number of different nature-based enterprises within smart tech. Of course, TreeTracker is one of them. We also represent soil sensor companies. We've got GIS-based companies, remote sensing, drone-based companies. A lot of different technologies are featured within this community. And if this is of interest to you, or any of these other communities that you see here, whether that's nature-based solutions for health and well-being, whether that's sustainable tourism, whether that's community engagement, water management, there's so many different angles to attack this nature-based solutions sector from, that I really encourage you to check it out. As a last reminder, on this nature-based enterprises platform, there's also a variety of different knowledge and resources that I can absolutely recommend, whether that's the Nature-Based Enterprises Guidebook, which gives you an idea of what's in there. We've just outfitted the resources section with podcast episodes, research, toolkits, market insights. There's just about everything for everybody there that's interested in this stuff. So without further ado, I would love to invite you all to register yourself, or if you represent one, your nature-based enterprise at naturebasedenterprise.eu. We'd love to see you on the platform, and we'll encourage you to do so throughout this webinar. Now, without further ado, I would love to pass over the virtual stage to Dirk van Riel, who is going to be giving us an interactive presentation on TreeTracker, and not just in terms of what the company is and what it stands for and what we can learn from TreeTracker, but Dirk is really actually going to take us throughout his entrepreneurial journey, which I think will absolutely interest you. So without further ado, Dirk, the floor is yours.
Great. Thank you so much, Nadina, for this introduction and for this chance, and everybody for joining here this afternoon. I was kind of pondering last week which form to take for this webinar, and I, in cooperation with Nadina, decided just to give you a short story about what the journey of TreeTracker actually is. And not combined with all kinds of slides and pitch deck, but just to give you some information. So to give you a general idea of what the journey was, where we began, what the bigger picture is, where TreeTracker stands today, and what it took to get there, and especially get into the nitty-gritty, get into the lessons learned on that journey. I will try to keep it within the 20-minute mark, so we have more than time enough to answer your questions and to have this discussion about the need for ways to get the value of trees across, because that's my main focus. Is trees are a vital part of our sustainable cities. And we can't have trees enough, so plant more trees. That's basically what I'm trying to say this afternoon, but I'll use a little bit more words for that. And I'm so glad to be able to have this talk to you for a number of reasons, but the most primary reason is that it isn't that obvious that we are here with 40-odd people talking about the importance of trees and green tech solutions helping that along. It hasn't always been the case. And there's a little bit of a segue going back 15 years in time. Nadina mentioned it already. My first job was actually tree inspector 15 years ago. And to explain a bit why I became tree inspector 15 years ago, I have to go back 25 years, even when Dutch legislation, I'm from the Netherlands, Dutch legislation changed. And I won't go into the details, there's a great story behind it, but turns out from 1995 onwards in the Netherlands, tree owners were responsible for the well-being of their tree, and if there was damage because the tree was mal-managed, then you will be liable as a tree owner. So that was the starting sign for an epic change in the way we looked at trees until then. It was the beginning of structurized tree management, certainly in the Netherlands. Okay, a bit fast forward to 10 years later, so 15 years ago, I ended my studies in forestry, found out there isn't too much forest to be had in the Netherlands. So I had to shift focus a little bit. And then I found out there was something called tree management and tree consultancy. And that really was everything I was looking for, because I've always liked to be outside and I always like to look at trees, basically. So, and that was a total job for me, just look at trees, and that was great. And the job, for you who don't know this, basically is you go outside 15 years ago with this big old laptop, which is heavy and it's slow, and it has this software on it, which is also slow. And there is this map with all these dots on the map, and these dots resemble a tree. Click on a dot, a pop-up window appears, and you can enter information, GIS information, right? So for people who know this. Well, the first job I got was in the south of the Netherlands in countryside, and I had no experience whatsoever. And I started inspecting my first tree, and I started inspecting with the species and condition and height and trunk diameter and the maintenance that need to be carried out. And the first tree was an oak, and it was in pretty poor condition. It was like 15 meters high. It had a trunk diameter of 40 centimeters, and it had a lot of dead branches in there, so it needed to be pruned. That was my first tree. It took me well over 5 minutes. If you would ask me now, having inspected more than 100,000 trees in the first couple of years of my professional life, if you would call me right now and you would say, Dirk, I'm in the south of the Netherlands, I'm in countryside, I'm looking at a tree, tell me what kind of tree I'm looking at, I would say, you're looking at an oak in pretty poor condition with a lot of dead wood in there, I should prune it. And that's because of reference, right? I since then seen 100,000 trees. I've had a lot of reference, so knowledge base built up in my head. And I'll relate to this back later, but this was very important to me. And in the last 15 years, there's so much changed from the way we from the laptops we use, are faster and lighter and better, and the software is better and smarter. But most of all, the mindset has changed. When I started out 15 years ago with tree inspections, trees were just an asset. And even worse, they were just an asset. They weren't that valuable. They were just nice to look at. But if there were any reconstruction of a road or whatever, trees were the first objects, the first assets to be cut down and replaced afterwards. That's something you can't think of right now, right? 2021, going on to 2022, trees are this vital part, this vital piece of the puzzle to make resilient cities, make sustainable cities, make livable cities, right? And that's this big shift in mindset that's got me the most, and that's got me really excited. And that's, like I mentioned, the reason why we're all here is I hope because we think trees and green and nature in general is important, but that hasn't always been so obvious. It was only 8 years ago that there were Dutch municipalities who had problems with getting their budget final, went on doing budget costs by cutting down healthy trees. 8 years ago, 2013. Think about that now. What would happen if I'm now in the city of Amsterdam. If the city of Amsterdam would say, okay, guys, we have this small budget problem, we're going to cut down 5,000 trees. I think we would have a problem, but this was the real case scenario only 8 years ago. Of course, I'm talking about the Dutch situation, but I'm talking about a broader understanding, a broader momentum that we've got going on as a green professionals. I call you all green professionals or green enthusiasts. We have this momentum going on that we don't need to talk about the importance of nature, about trees, about biodiversity. We only need to take actions now because we've got this momentum going on, which is great, which is awesome. The only thing that we haven't changed, and that's a little bit of a segue to my to the TreeTracker proposition. I didn't mention this before, but I'm totally not going to make a commercial out of this. I'm just referencing to TreeTracker as the journey we're taking, because I think it's maybe an interesting story for you, and hopefully it's also somewhat inspiring or gives you ideas to move on with your own professional life. But the segue to TreeTracker is 15 years later, we have this momentum going on, but we're still sending out boys and girls with laptops, with GIS software, inspecting trees manually, tree by tree, outside, visually, guessing the height, guessing the trunk diameter, guessing the condition of trees. And that's just not good enough anymore. And this is of bigger importance. If you have high quality information, you can make every tree count. And that's basically what my general proposition for today would be make every tree count. If you know what the crown volume of a tree is, and you know what the trunk volume of a tree is, you can easily calculate how much carbon there's stored in there, how much air there's pollution there's filtered, how much water there's retained, how much cooling effect a tree has. If you have good information, if you have excellent information, and you can make it repeatable, you know exactly how big your tree is in 2020 and 21 and 22, you can actually make predictions. What would this tree do for me in 15 or 20 years time? Because these trees, well, I mentioned, everybody knows trees are important, right? But there's carbon storage and there's, well, health and happiness. And Nadina knows so much more about this than I do, but trees just make you happy. There are this intangible value of trees is magnificent, but also the tangible assets, so the carbon storage and the air filtration and the water retention and the heat of the cooling effect, they're so valuable, and we can actually measure them. There are tools for that. iTree is one of them, but we need high quality information. And if we know exactly what we have now, we make the trees we've got now count, we can monitor it. We can also optimize it. If we know what we've got now in trees, and we can also calculate if we would try to up the condition of trees by giving there more space around it, so less stones in the streets and more grass and shrubs in the street, then we could up the condition of trees, and we could actually monitor what those values would go up to. And that would make every tree count even more. And then looking even further, if we know where the trees are now, we also know where there aren't any trees. So we can plant trees smarter, and we can make those new trees count. And that's something that's really has my special interest, because there is this great wave of expectance for the green professionals coming at us that we should plant more trees. Okay, that's great. But which trees should we plant? Where should we plant trees? How should we plant trees? To be honest, if you want to store carbon, stop planting trees in the street, but start planting forest, right? But if you want to improve livability, then start planting trees in your street, because the trees in the forest aren't going to help livability in your city. My opinion, of course. So if you have your ambitions as a city, so you want to be net zero in 2030, or you want to up biodiversity, that ambition should be your reference point, your ambition where you are focusing on. So every tree that you are planting should be in the right direction of that ambition. So make every tree count. That would be my point. Okay, so I've hopefully made my point about this. But then going back to the business proposition and making a use case out of this. So we have this idea, TreeTracker, that planting the right tree at the right place in the right way would amount later on in better value of trees and in more health and livable cities. But that's a big ambition to have. And what would be the first step? And the first step, what came to us, was thrown in our laps, because there was this company back in the beginning of 2019 called Sobold, which is a Dutch AI company. It's AI for sustainability, everything. So they do everything regarding AI versus sustainability. And they called me and another partner of mine, a company called Bomenwacht, which is a Dutch tree consultancy company. And they called us and they said, well, we want to meet because we have this idea that we could automatically measure up trees very precisely. Oh, and that was the first puzzle in our first piece in our puzzle to reach our own goals, own ambitions. So that was actually the informal start of TreeTracker, because we want to smarten up green cities. That's our tagline, has been ever since. Smarten up green cities. So we want to use the power of AI and combine it with tree knowledge and make greener cities. That's basically what our proposition is and what we want to do. But you have to start somewhere, right? So Nadina already mentioned going from use case to business case. We have this great idea, but you have to start somewhere. And we decided to start at recognizing in trees, detecting trees and measuring them up very precisely. And that's important because for now, for our normal everyday job, that helps tree inspectors to have high quality information to work from. But in the near future, it will help us to make every tree count. So that would be our bigger purpose. So at the end of 2019, we started with development. And the first couple of months were pure building framework and deciding what to do and what not to do. And we found 3 pilot municipalities in the Netherlands. And basically what we did, and I will go briefly into the technical details, because otherwise my entire story won't make any sense anymore. So please forgive me for this technical bit. But we can automatically detect trees from mobile mapping data. And mobile mapping is Street View on steroids. So if you get Street View, you've got a panoramic photograph, camera mounted on a car, drives through the street, right? Everybody hopefully knows Street View. Mobile mapping is Street View, including a laser scanner mounted on top. And that laser scanner makes a 3D representation of public space, of the street it drives by, and it creates a large amounts of data. I won't go into too much detail, but we have found a way to use that data to extract each individual tree and store that into a database. And once we have this 3D image of this tree, we can very accurately measure up height and of course location and trunk diameter and crown volume and all other kinds of stuff. And we can actually use that information to calculate carbon storage, air filtration, water retention, like I mentioned. So that will be the first step. So our basic business proposition now is we can automatically detect trees for you and deliver you very high quality tree information. The business case behind that is interesting because this has never been our goal, right? We have never wanted to start this company to automatically detect trees. But this other company came to us and he partnered up with us, and they are a tree inspection company. And they asked us, can you deliver us a foundation of high quality tree information in which we can inspect on, so in which we can build on. And that became the business case. So what we do now in the last year for 15 Dutch municipalities is let this mobile mapping system drive through a city, automatically extract tree information, deliver that to the tree inspection company, and they go outside and inspect each individual tree, which is not my end goal, but well, we're getting somewhere. And the great thing about this is that because we do all the boring work, so the location and the height and the trunk diameter, whatever, the inspector has more fun in his job, which is important, but it's also faster in inspection. So the total project only costs roughly 10% more than a traditional inspection would cost, which is interesting because every business case is, of course, the quality of your business case is important and the impact it will make is important, but also costs in real life, costs are also important. So the great thing we had going from the end of 2020 until now, we have worked with just a product, which is also our business case, because it's also our first puzzle piece for the bigger puzzle. Won't say it hasn't come with any lessons learned, and maybe that's something the nitty gritty I was talking about. Wouldn't want to keep that from you. But because we started out in January with the first pilot projects, and the first pilot projects were only one neighborhood in the city, right? So 3,000 trees. We used a very compact mobile mapping system, so a low output of data. And we were so excited. We, after 3 months, end of February, beginning of March, we had this complete deep learning model ready to go, and we had great results, and we were so happy. We felt like Lewis Hamilton at Abu Dhabi 8 laps before finishing. But then something happened, because then we got this phone call from the city of Rotterdam, and they asked us, can you detect all of our 200,000 trees? And oh yeah, can you use a high quality tree mobile mapping system, which has a very high output? And we said, of course we can, because we were over the moon with this job. It was great. It was awesome. But it totally amounted to more than 200 times more data for this first project than we had for the pilots. So we use cloud computing, we uploaded to the cloud computer, we pressed go, and the thing just crashed. It amounted to nothing. It just error after error, and nothing happened. And it was made perfect sense, because what we have done, we've made we've went from developing from proof of concept framework to a version 1.0. Oh, something doesn't work. Okay, a developer A does this, developer D does that. There was no real great management on that. And for the pilots, it worked awesome, but for this first project, it was just too big. And that's my first lesson learned for today. It was respect the process. You don't go from development to pilot to big project. You go from small pilot to medium pilot or big pilot. You go to a small project, then you go back to piloting again because you screwed up, and then you go to a project, and you end up with the city of Rotterdam in our case. We went a bit too fast. Lesson learned. What we did, just for interest sake, we just shuffled the pieces of our deep learning model a bit. We found out there were actually loops in there, so data was analyzed 4 times instead of 1 time. There was also, it was all in series, so it was all serial. So every block of data was ran through the algorithm after each other instead of parallel. We made management software, so we can now speed up to 80 virtual machines at once to pump through big amounts of data. So we don't have this problem anymore. So we learned from this. We also learned that you have to do what you're good at. In the first couple of months, I was really involved in micromanaging developers, and that's the last thing I should do. Did I mention I had a study in forestry? So there was this problem that I was allowing myself to be involved in development, and I shouldn't have been. And other way around, developers were also involved in making definitions for tree features. So for example, the bottom side of a tree, you can have a whole discussion about this. What is the lowest branch on a tree? Are you counting in the leaves? Are you working from the outside of the crown, or are you looking at the attachment to the trunk? There's this whole world of discussion going on if you really want to define every part of a tree. And instead of having that discussion, we just ask the developers, well, pick something, but that doesn't amount to anything. So that's also a lesson that we've learned. And maybe the last lesson that we learned, and I think I'm well through my 20 minutes then, is that we, and that's maybe on a personal level, we went from this big idea, smartening up green cities, we want to make every tree count, to delivering data to municipalities, which is great because it was a business case, but it isn't our goal. So I found myself at the beginning of the summer of this year, very low on energy, lacking focus, not really be bothered to do all that much. And I'm a bit of an enthusiastic guy. So if I'm a bit low on energy, there's something going on. And then I found out, well, we're not keeping track of our own focus or our own goals. So we have this big goal, right? Smartening up green cities. Why are we doing data deliveries, right? That should be part of the business, but it can't be the whole business. We were focusing so much on this business case, which is going really well. We have done 500,000 trees in the last year. So that's, for us, that's epic. But it can't be the purpose for our goal. We want to make more impact, and we would know we can make more impact if we try to make every tree count. So we now working on ways to determine how can we up the value of trees, of existing trees. How can we determine which tree to plant where, in which way, to make it count in 10 years time. And that gave a whole new level of energy, and a whole new level of energy, not only to me, but to the whole team. And also that helps making better products. So also the customers, the municipalities that we work for, they are also more enthusiastic about it, because we over deliver in the end, because we have all these new ideas which we are incorporating in our data, which they get for free. So that's basically the 3 main lessons learned from this journey until today. And hopefully TreeTracker journey will move on to go well into 2030 and on. But for now, I think that's basically my 3 lessons learned, Nadina. I think I'm well through the 20 minutes you gave me, but I hope it's okay.
No, that's great. Thank you so much, Dirk. And I have to applaud you, and I think others in the room right now with us as well, for your honesty and your openness with sharing with us what some of the hardships have been, some of perhaps the less proud moments throughout your entrepreneurial journey so far, which ultimately I think teach you the biggest lessons, which end up creating a better business and a better product at the end of the day. So kudos to you for that. I have a number of questions that I want to ask you. Before I do so, I want to invite everyone here. If you're shy, feel free to drop your question in the chat box. And if you're not shy, please feel free to raise your hand, and we'd love for you to ask the question personally to Dirk or to I. So first of Dirk, to kick us off in this discussion, you, I think, very well mapped out these 3 different main lessons that you hope to learn, and or that you've learned so far from your journey with TreeTracker. And what I'm really curious about is, how does the TreeTracker solution compare to manual tree inspections? And is that comparison, is that the primary value proposition that you bring in when you go to talk to a new municipality, or perhaps it's something entirely different?
Oh, that's a great question. Well, I think there is one obvious, well, there are a couple of obvious reasons for me to give as advantages, and the biggest advantage is that you get more data, which is also reliable and repeatable. And that's maybe because I'm a bit of a green tech nerd at this moment. I like
Welcome
to
to the club.
Sorry?
Welcome to the club.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I like to have data repeatable. I don't, if the quality is pretty low, but if I can still repeat it and I know what the downsides and the upsides are, I can still use it for modeling. So, but now we have this proposition where the quality is pretty high, so it's up to 95% and up for most asset features, and that's great. So, if I can use that information to determine carbon storage, that's something you couldn't do with a traditional tree inspection, because you would guess height and you would guess crown diameter and whatever, but you wouldn't ever get to a real accurate crown volume or very accurate trunk volume. So that's an obvious, for me, an obvious upside on top of the repeatability. So if I get data from 2019, I can relay it through our model and get information that I can one-on-one relate to the 2021 data. So that's for me very interesting. But don't forget, there we have this big wave of questions coming at us as green professionals, and there aren't that many tree inspectors around and hanging on. So after, for me, after a couple of years, or after a couple of months, actually, I get a bit tired with every tree determining trunk diameter, determining height. Come on, there must be a smarter way for this. Well, it took 15 years, but we got it now. And that's something. So we need less tree inspectors, and we get them to do cooler, nicer, more fun jobs. And that's something that's, I think, pretty important. And maybe lastly, I think just using the data, and I'm a real believer of opening up data. All these information that we collect is basically paid for by municipalities. So if we can make this data open data, the other companies and other universities and other people who have great ideas can also use this. And because we know what the quality is, we can, without hesitation, spread the data instead of the word. So that would be also something positive.
No, absolutely. And I think you touch upon a really good point there, which I think a lot of people aren't aware of, which is that we've got a massive shortage when it comes to green professionals now and absolutely in the future, as this sector And so far, arboriculture, the study of trees, the science of trees, the practice of taking care of trees, and horticulture, both of those, as you know, we have mayors all over the world saying we're going to plant X million trees, we're going to plant, you know, tens of millions of trees. We want our cities to be climate proof, be resilient. Mayors are screaming this at the top of lungs, but we don't really understand that we have a massive shortage of professionals who can actually help us get there. And this is something that the arboricultural field has been facing for years, and something that's really going to kind of come to a head once this sector starts growing and the shortage increases as well. So if we can find ways to make the profession of arboriculture, the profession of a tree care manager, sexier by being able to use technology in a way so that tree inspectors actually hang on longer than for a couple of seasons, because you know it firsthand after doing it for 15 years. I know it firsthand just from doing it for 6 months as part of my PhD research, having to map these trees. I mean, and after 6 months, I was completely done with it. So I can only understand what 15 years does to you after a while. So on that note, how do you think, before we get to some of these great questions from our audience, how do you think the role of technology within the green sector specifically, how do you think that will accelerate interest in the field of arboriculture?
Yeah, well, I hope it will. For me, I went from tree inspector to, well, a whole bunch of roles I played to end up in IT, in an IT company, a software company. Because there was a lack of innovation and a lack of new, fresh ideas at that time. So this is, I'm talking about, well, 8-10 years ago. And for me, I ran back to the green sector as a green professional when I found out there was actually some innovation going on, and actually some movement and some way to make impact. And we now see the reversed effect. A partner of us has this education to become a tree inspector and tree consultant, and they see people from every type of background coming to them to follow this course, because people want to have an impact, big or small. And want to be involved in urban, in green, and in making a livable city or a livable environment. And I think that's great. And combining that with technology, which makes it, like you mentioned, sexy. For a while in our offers we had green tech is sexy. It's funny that you mention it, but. I think that's very important. And also you touch on a point which I want to mention before we go to the questions, is that there is this big ambition from policy makers, right, and from aldermen and from mayors. Okay, we need to be climate net zero in 2030. Well, okay, and then what's the next step? Nobody tells you what the next step should be. And I think if you are a tree manager, you are not working on bridging the gap between vision and operation. You should be working with managing your trees. But technology can help you bridge the gap, can help you determining, okay, this is what somebody, some policymaker shouted out, and some alderman has committed to it. Okay, that's great. So this is the ambition. This is the goal we are aiming at. And this is the timeline we've got. Let technology help us define a roadmap for the tree manager and for the green sector to actually work to that. And if it's not possible, if it's not feasible, then red flags, go back to the policymaker, go back to the alderman and say, okay, this is nice that you asked this of us, but give us a whole pile of money extra so we can actually work on getting this ambition to be reality. So that's, yeah. I think that's also an importance of technology in the green sector.
No, I agree. That reminds me of something that Matthew Wells, the senior urban forester for the city of Santa Monica in California, said on an episode of my podcast. He was talking about that the role of technology within the arboricultural field helps typically only one tree care manager that each municipality might have. I mean, some people think that there's entire teams for municipalities. Even a city like Amsterdam, which is in charge of some 400,000 odd trees, typically only has one or two people where that is their entire mandate. And that role of technology, when used responsibly and properly, can free up some of that day-to-day operations so that they can indeed focus on the what's next step, which is so often forgotten in this discourse. Without further ado, I want to turn to some of the great questions we've been getting in the chat. But before I turn my attention to the chat box, I would love to ask Martin, who's got his hand up for a while, to ask his question to Dirk.
Yes, thank you, Nadina. And thank you, Dirk. It was a really inspiring talk. I'm super enthusiastic about this topic. I was wondering, you were shortly talking about that you can hear me, right? Just to check.
Perfect.
Okay, good. Yeah, I was wondering, you were shortly talking about how these measurements might be translated to something like ecosystem services, like water retention, carbon storage. And you were talking about the ambition in policy. Have you already seen that policymakers are really interested in this ecosystem services part, where they ask like, hey, can you map the carbon storage of our trees? Is that already happening, or is that like more of an ambition from the business side, which still needs to be imposed on policymakers?
That's a good question. Honestly talking about this even yesterday with some friends of mine. You're absolutely right. There is not every municipality, every city is using these ecosystem, these values of trees for policy making. There are some positive examples, which in the Netherlands, the city of The Hague has an excellent tree policy just released with a canopy coverage and an ambition for X percentage of extra canopy coverage in 2030. So that's great. Utrecht, city of Utrecht is also working on it. But besides the Dutch municipalities, I see, especially in the European Union, I see a lot of cities who don't have a lot of background knowledge or data, who want to make leapfrog to this great ambition that every tree should count. And that's also because there are all these programs. For example, the European Commission has entered this tender for 100 cities to become climate neutral by 2030. There are all these different cities entering that tender and trying to get there. And for me, it's interesting to see that especially cities who don't have all that much are now leapfrogging to the front lines of this change, this momentum, and are actually grabbing onto this chance to become and become climate neutral and have their assets in order. So that's a great. Of course, there's nothing wrong with being trying to reach two goals at the same time. So I only compliment them.
That's awesome.
Very much.
We've got a great question from Jakob that's turned into a little bit of a combo question in the chat box. So I want to start with Jakob's question. He asked, what parameters can be mapped with TreeTracker? So I think, Dirk, it might be good. You mentioned already a couple of them throughout your presentation, but maybe just to line them up, everything that the algorithms of TreeTracker pick up on.
Yeah, of course. I didn't mention that because, like I mentioned, I didn't want to make it into a commercial. I want to talk about the importance of green tech. But what we
Here's
do,
your green light.
Yes. What we do is we start out with detecting the tree within the data, right? So we store that 3D tree in a database. Then we determine the location of the tree based on the center of the trunk at ground level. We then do height, which is more than 95% accurate. We do the underside of the crown diameter, and also crown volume, trunk diameter, the lowest branch that's going from the tree, so the underside of the crown from a trunk perspective, so the lowest branch on the trunk, and the lowest branch in the crown, which is the underside of the crown. And then we do an analysis on does is there encroachment? Are there trees, branches hanging within the road or a road obstacle-free zone? And that's basically what we do now. So we don't do species. I think I saw the question for species. There's this really interesting short story about this. I will make this into a 1-minute story, but we are actually looking into determining species based on the 3D tree, the point cloud tree, as we call it. And it was done in a really development kind of way. The developers just looked for the 10 most or the 15 most common trees in our database and tried to determine if they could automatically detect species. But I, as a green professional, if I look outside the window, there are a bunch of trees which I will definitely see and remark as being some kind of tree based on their habitus, based on the shape of their crown. But we didn't go that way. We didn't go the tree consultant way. We went the development way. So we're now exactly no step further. So there's and we found out that it's pretty difficult to find these small differences and make that into training data for our deep learning model. But it hasn't been a run race, so I hope there is still room within our development sprints for next year to get further on that. We know we can automatically detect trees with panoramic photograph imagery, but that's something we have only done in proof of concept. So that's something.
The species.
Exactly. Yeah. Species,
yeah. No, because that I think hopefully, Jakob, that gives you an overview of everything that is measured within TreeTracker. But it touched upon an interesting comment that someone made in the chat box. Julio DeMarco, he says that he's a public servant for a local government in Brazil, and that they've detected almost 200 species in their street trees that are not considered on iTree, which, just quickly to loop back to another question that was asked by Taylor Hughes. Taylor Hughes asked, do you develop your own algorithms in-house to calculate ecosystem services, or do you use existing software as iTree? I know that you use iTree to make these ecosystem services calculations. So maybe you just want to give a quick touch upon how you use iTree, and then we'll head back to Julio's question.
If you have ever used iTree, you know it's great, but it's also a black box. So you send,
and maybe for those, some people that might not know iTree, maybe just define it quickly.
Exactly, of course, yeah. It's I don't know the exact history of iTree, but it was among the first was Davies, which is a company in the US, and the US Ministry of Forestry. They designed this method of determining value of trees, which they called iTree. And it is open. You can use it for free. You send an Excel sheet, or sorry, a spreadsheet with your tree data, and it will feed back whatever you've sent them. But it's, like I mentioned, a little bit of a black box, because you can't use an API or whatever type of way to automatically share this information with iTree. So that's the way we use it, and we use now iTree because that's also something that's internationally recognized. So we have already enough of a discussion with tree managers about the fact that we are automatically detecting trees, that we didn't want the other discussion in how are you measuring carbon storage. So that's the reason why we use iTree. And also it's pretty great that they have done all this work in this calculation. So that's how we use it.
No, that's brilliant, because that adds on to, as I was saying, Julio, who works for a local government in Brazil, has detected these 200 species in his street trees, but he finds it very hard to assess the value of these species because they are not considered on iTree. And I know in the Netherlands, iTree has recently come over, and there is now a Netherlands-specific iTree, and I think that's something that might follow along for different countries. But Julio specifically asked, we find it very hard to assess the value of those species since we have to create the information. Does TreeTracker offer an option to deal with this problem?
The option that we use is pretty low tech, because we just we filter out whatever we can't whatever species we are not recognized. We look for if there is a species that's very common, very near to the species, we then just use that data. And otherwise, we have this discussion with our tree consultants for just a question. Okay, what does this tree resemble? This species resemble? And we don't have 200 completely different species in the Netherlands. So maybe that's something I can't really say, but most of those 200 may be cultivars, so maybe just a different type of species within the same range. And species and cultivar is never that important for, most of the time, not that important for the iTree calculation. So, but nonetheless, there is room for improvement in the iTree calculation. I think they would be very excited to incorporate those 200 species from Julio. So I would encourage to get in touch with the iTree people and try to set up a way to solve this problem, because this is I would also almost call it a luxury problem.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And maybe just to add on to that, Derek, what's your opinion on when iTree is not available, like in the case of Julio, but honestly, like in the case of many other places in the world that might want to use this, what would be your recommendation? Would you say that it's worthwhile of saying, okay, the average tree soaks up this much carbon, filters this much air pollutants? Do you think it's still worthwhile to give kind of an average estimation of what the ecosystem services might be? Or do you think that the margin of error is too large, that it therefore, it just confuses the whole thing and you shouldn't bother?
Yeah, well, okay, that's for me maybe difficult to answer fully, but whether you're in Brazil or in the Netherlands or in the US, the carbon storage amount will amount to exactly the same number, because there is no translation there. So air pollution, there's a different story. The monetization, so the making into dollars or euros or whatever, that is also dependent on where you live. But the carbon storage and the water retention, they just are exactly the same wherever geographical location you have. So there's no problem there. And yes, you could use a general species. And I think most of the species are there in general and you can use them. But if the species are entirely not in the iTree database, I would say you should try to incorporate it, because there will be a significant difference between real life and your analysis.
Yeah, and in the future, also being able to include those photo panoramas. So not only collecting that LiDAR, that 3D mobile mapping data in terms of LiDAR point clouds, but also including the photo material will ultimately provide the basis to be able to create more, ecosystem service estimations at a higher granularity as well, which I think is an exciting avenue for the future.
Definitely.
Marlene, I hope I said that right. She had an interesting question, which was, once a database is created for a municipality, how often do you plan to update it?
Well, it depends on what your need is and what the municipality has as a need. If you want to use it as for your tree management, I would say every 3 to 5 years would be fine. But if you're looking into ways for monitoring your ambitions for being climate neutral or whatever, then I would say almost yearly, or maybe once every 2 years. But we're now talking, of course, about TreeTracker, right? But we're not the only way. The mobile mapping data is not the only way to map trees. I think it's one of the most high quality ways to do so, but I wouldn't be good at my job if I didn't say that. But you could also add on this tree information that you get, this high quality tree information that you get every 3 years, and add on to that with layers of maybe satellite imagery or aerial photographs or whatever you got, or just tree inspections manually. Every data point that you collect will have some relevance to monitoring reaching your ambitions. But I have to come back to my first remark I made earlier. If you have repeatable data, that's always best, because that will give you a good representation and also a good prospectus a good way to look how would my tree values be in 20 years time. And if you use all kinds of different data sources, you won't be able to do that. So yeah.
Yeah, I think that time series component is probably one of the things that makes TreeTracker so interesting, is being able to do these year-over-year analyses, which is something that I feel like a lot of municipalities and city officials want or ask for, but the data just isn't really there to give them an accurate idea of what that might be.
Exactly, and one on top of that, if you use mobile mapping data or aerial lidar or aerial photographs, there is this data set often already dating back to 5 years earlier. So you could start today with making a log of the growth of your trees from today on, and you can work backwards and use that to predict your growth and your growth from today. So that's great. So the times we are living in are awesome. So we have this focus on trees, we have this focus on data collecting and making that valuable, which is, well, frankly, awesome to work with. So that's yeah. I would say start now, start today, and make every tree count.
And a couple last practical questions before we close up. Ralph had an interesting question around how common is the use of GIS for tree management among Dutch municipalities?
Yeah, pretty common, and that relates back to the changing in the law dating back to 1995, where there was this need for not only structurized management of trees, but also writing down that you have inspected the tree, that you have found a problem or not, and that you have advised or given advice for a maintenance, some maintenance, and that's actually been taken care of. There is this legislation which helped us a lot. So I think out of the 350 municipalities that we got, more than 300 have a GIS system filled with tree information. I won't say anything about the quality, but there is this reference. And that's maybe quite unique. I don't know if that's unique, but that's something, the reason why I could start with this 15 years ago is because of that legislation 25 years ago. So yeah, I'm happy with it.
Yeah, and I think it's probably one of the contributing success factors of TreeTracker being a Dutch company to begin with. I think the Dutch market was ready for this, considering that 1995 change in law and this, continued history of doing these annual tree inspections and having it mandatory by law. I mean, if you compare that to some cities across the pond, for example, the city of Boston is actually doing its first ever tree inventory, as in the history of ever, right now. Yeah. Its first ever tree inventory. That means that the chief urban forester of the city of Boston, again, a city that has over millions of trees, was not aware of where all these trees were, their condition, nothing. So that gives you an idea of kind of where the Dutch market is at, and I think why TreeTracker has been very successful in the Dutch market, and how now, hopefully, with those proven case studies in the Netherlands, TreeTracker is ready for world domination, because the world needs it, that's for sure.
Well, that's great to hear. Yeah, and just to add on that, we're pretty. I didn't want to mention it, but yes, you're absolutely right. We have this we have this lot of tree knowledge in the Netherlands, and one thing that really struck me that in, for example, the city of Paris, if you plant 100 trees, 30 trees will die within the first 3 to 5 years, and if you plant a tree in the Netherlands, only 15 out of 100 will die. So 15% instead of 30% young trees dying off. And that's a number of reasons, but that's because the way we plant it, that's because of what we plant, and that's because of how we manage those trees after they're planted. And that's also a mindset, right? So with the same budget, the same amount of euros, put it in one single tree, you could either have 70 trees or 85 trees out of 100 being successful and growing old. And I think that's also something we can use internationally, and people can learn from that. And there are a lot of companies also in the Netherlands who are willing to share that knowledge.
Yeah, I mean, I think we could organize an entire webinar just of tree management as a Dutch export product, which I think would be quite interesting to talk about. Dirk, one last question. I know we're running out of time, so try to give me a 30-second response to this one before we close off, which I think is a really interesting one. Mamuka has asked, are you sometimes in need of blurring images of trees like Google is doing with our faces or certain houses even on Google Street View? Is there any GDPR case to be made for trees? Interesting question, especially when it comes to GDPR and the role of technology. What do you say to data privacy when it comes to trees?
Well, fortunately, there is no real privacy issues with trees, except maybe the name of the tree inspector. So we don't have that problem right now. And we're fortunate with that because that gives us the opportunity to make it open data if we would like to. So, but there's definitely there are municipalities who are afraid of opening up their data because they're afraid that people will know there is a tree to be maintained in their street and they will call them. So that's definitely going on, but I wouldn't say there is this big privacy problem with trees at this moment. I hope this answers the question within 30 seconds.
Brilliant. I think that's great. I just pasted the TreeTracker URL, the website, for anyone that's interested in reading more. I encourage you again to check out Dirk's episode on the Internet of Nature podcast if you can't get enough of Dirk and TreeTracker. Truly great questions, guys. I really appreciate your participation. And I remind you again to please log on to naturebasedenterprises.eu to make an account either for yourself or for your nature-based enterprise. It would be great to see you there within the Smart Tech for Nature-based community, as we'll be having several more of these webinars in the year to come. So with that, thank you very much. Thank you to Dirk. Thank you to all of you for coming, and I wish you all a very Merry Christmas. Bye, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye now.